This tutorial is going to show you how to merge together HDR photos, which is where you have an underexposed image and an overexposed image, and you're putting those together to create good exposure that's going to really have that high definition of contrast and a lot of detail in the image. So here's a few examples. And this can work really well with a lot of your product images. So if that's the case, I would definitely take some pictures underexposed, some overexposed, and some with good lighting, so you're able to merge those together to create these really detailed HDR photos such as this one. So starting out in Photoshop, we're going to merge those layers together. So I'm going to go to File, Scripts, and then Load Files into Stack, just like Multiplicity from Level 1. I'm going to go to Browse and find where my images are saved. So I have this one here that's overexposed, this one here with the medium good exposure, and then this one here that is underexposed or too dark. So I'm going to select those and hit Open. And then make sure that you click Attempt to automatically line source images. That way, if the tripod maybe shifted a little bit when you took your picture, it's going to automatically line everything up for you. So then I'm going to hit OK. So here are my 3 layers. So on the top, it's overexposed, good exposure, and then underexposed. If you have one layer that has maybe a good exposure, so like this middle one, I would put that on the top, so that way as we're working we can keep that image that has a good exposure and kind of work with it that way. With your darker image, something that works well is almost creating a vignette using it. So it's going to be a nice faded vignette. So I'm going to move this overexposed picture underneath for now. And on my top layer, I'm going to add a mask. And with the mask, you're going to be using your paintbrush, just like Multiplicity with Level 1. And I'm going to make sure that this is set to normal. Instead of soft light, I'm going to bring my opacity about 50%. And then using the black paintbrush, I'm going to start painting around the outside of my image to create that vignette or soft edge. So you can see I'm starting to mask off part of my lighter image here on the top, and that's bringing some of the darker image underneath, and it's starting to slowly create a vignette. So using that vignette is one thing to kind of experiment or play around with. If you really like the lighting of the entire backdrop, so maybe you want a really dark backdrop and that object in the foreground to stand out more, you can just continue that around here. You could even use your quick selection tool, select around your object, and that way as you're masking, you will only mask off the background and it will be a little easier to capture that detail. So from here I can go to Select, Inverse, so now it has the background selected. So I'm able to grab that paintbrush and really darken up that background here. So that's one thing to try again if you really want maybe that darker backdrop, especially if you're doing something with the black background and you want that to really stand out and still make your object jump forward. That's one thing you can do, and then hit Command D to get rid of your selection there. Right now though, I'm just going to delete this for now and show you another edit that you can do. Using the gradient tool, there's a couple different things you can experiment with. I'm just going to use the regular gradient color here, so the black, and then I'm going to use the radial gradient. And if I add a mask to my image first, or to my layer, I can click and drag to create that fade within my image. And my gradient is not working, I just realized, because of the mode. So double check your mode at the top. Make sure instead of screen or any other overlay, that is set to normal. So double check, but this should work now. As I click and drag across my screen, you'll start to see in the mask it's bringing some of that darker area to the foreground here. So I can maybe click and drag a little bit further. So different angles are going to create different effects with your mask, so you can kind of experiment with that a little bit using the gradient tool. You can try out some of these other modes, so maybe this one that goes up and down here instead. So try some of those out. So now we're going to load and merge our layers into the HDR format. So go to the top of your screen to File, down to Automate, and then Merge to HDR Pro. So So this is going to merge our images and give us the different HDR settings. I'm going to hit Browse and find where my 3 photos were. So I'm going to select those, holding down Shift, clicking on the first and the last to select them all, and then Open. Then I'm going to hit OK, and it might take a minute to load. This works with JPEGs as well, but it's going to bring up my HDR settings. So after it loads, your image is going to look something like this. So it's going to merge those 3 together. And on the right side, it gives you a lot of different presets within these HDR settings that look really neat that you can experiment with. They all do different things. One thing I would play around with is the detail. So you can bring out some of that detail in your image. You can play around with the exposure to get some good lighting. So it might have been a little bit too bright. So I can bring that down. Another thing at the top of your screen are some different custom presets. Some of these over-edit your image, so I would just be careful and watch that. But choose some of these different settings or presets and see what that will do for your photo. Whether it works well, or again, it could be doing too much to your photo. This could look interesting in parts, so you could always save one image and do what we did at the beginning where you're merging certain aspects of your photo together. So experiment with that as well. There's a lot, again, you could do with these settings. Alright, so once you find a setting that you like, there's a few other things you can work with. You can adjust the curves directly here, so adjusting that contrast, maybe the edge smoothness, so making some of that stand out more. Now obviously this preset is a little bit too much, so again, find one that's not going to look like it was over edited as you're working. But then you can hit OK. And your image will convert to the HDR. So now I have this image here. And if I go back to my photo on the top, it's going to bring up what I had just edited. So you can save this one separately. And then you can always place it over on your other file. So right now I'm just going to use my selection tool, click and drag this over, place it, try and line things up. And then once this is lined up, again, I can maybe move this to a bottom layer and add a mask to this top one. And using my paintbrush, I can maybe bring out some of that detail in the bottle here without maybe having too much detail in the background. So if I hide this, you can see how before there's too much going on, too much color in the background, it looks over edited. But now having this on the top and then starting to just bring out a little bit of that detail with the mask is going to help a lot to really create realism without it making too much over edits.